June of 1982, there was a young girl named Carol Ann Freeling. One night, while sleeping soundly, she was awoken by what can only be described as a presence. She left her bed and slowly descended the stairs to find her father asleep in his favourite chair, whilst the family television flickered brightly with nothing but static on the screen. Carol Ann, who was somewhat drawn to the television, sat down in front of it and almost immediately began talking to an inaudible, disembodied voice. Awoken by her demands to speak louder, Carol's family were soon making their way to the living room, whilst Carol's father, drowsy and confused, watched as she continued to converse with the screen. The next night, the family were awoken by a deafening rumble, causing the entire house to shake violently from floor to ceiling. And at this point, Carol, who it would seem was already awake, announced the arrival of something very evil, as she turned to her family and simply stated, "They're here." For those who know their Hollywood horror, they will have immediately recognised this story as the beginning of the award-winning 1982 horror blockbuster, Poltergeist. The film follows the Freeling family as they're terrorised by poltergeist activity, culminating in the struggle to save Carol Ann from an entity known simply as the Beast, who pulls her through the television into another dimension. The film was nominated for several Academy Awards in 1983, and in the same year won 3 Saturn Awards and a BAFTA in the UK. Whilst clearly inspired by historical stories of poltergeist activity and other folklore, the film was entirely fictitious, spawning several sequels, remakes and parodies over the years. But in 1977, a family from North London in England experienced something that they believed to be very real and very terrifying, and much like Poltergeist the film, the events that took place in London in 1977 achieved worldwide notoriety, attracting attention of national press in the UK, the Society for Psychical Research, and even husband and wife paranormal investigative team Ed and Lorraine Warren. And to this day, the haunting remains one of the most documented and researched poltergeist cases in the UK. Today, we look at the experiences of sisters Janet and Margaret Hodgson, more commonly known as the Enfield Poltergeist. On the 31st of August 1977, teenage sisters Janet and Margaret Hodgson were preparing for bed in their 3-bedroom council house at 284 Green Street in the North London borough of Enfield. At around 9:30 p.m, the girls began to hear shuffling and other unexplained noises in their room, which their mother, Peggy Hodgson, a recent divorcee, could also hear from the living room. Assuming the 2 girls were fighting, Peggy entered their room and told the girls they were to behave and stop making so much noise. The girls told their mother what they had heard, and before Peggy could dispute their claims, she witnessed the phenomena firsthand as a chest of drawers reportedly moved 18 inches across the floor. Peggy, who was perhaps somewhat confused, attempted to push the item of furniture back into place, but was unable to move it, and at this point she began to realise that something was not quite right in their home. The night continued with the house seemingly coming to life. As objects moved, items fell off the walls, and all over the house they heard strange noises. And in the early hours of the morning, having been too scared to sleep, Peggy and her daughters were understandably exhausted, and she decided it was time to ask someone for help. Vic Nottingham, a former builder, lived next door to the Hodgsons at number 282 Green Street, with his wife, also named Peggy, and their 20-year-old son Gary. After listening to his neighbours' stories, Vic offered to investigate for himself, hoping to lend some peace of mind to his terrified neighbours. And noted by Margaret as being a big burly bloke, Vic was apparently not easily scared, and with a history in the building trade, was all too used to the ambient noises that houses will often make as floorboards settle and pipes expand and contract with changing temperatures. But when Vic entered the house, even he was somewhat confused by the situation, stating that the knocking noises seemed to follow him as he moved from room to room, and whilst talking with the Hodgsons in the living room, they would all witness knocking coming from both the ceiling above and the floorboards directly under their feet. And Vic admitted that he also found himself beginning to feel quite frightened and decided it was time to call the police. And at around 1 AM, Police Constable Caroline Heaps and Police Constable Hyams arrived, and whilst taking notes, both claimed to witness the poltergeist activity firsthand.
It came off the floor, or nearly a ½ inch I should say, and I saw it slide off to the right, about 3.5 to 4 feet before it came to rest. I checked to see whether or not it could possibly have slid along the floor. I placed a marble on the floor to see whether or not the marble would go in the same direction as the chair did, and it didn't roll at all. I checked for wires under the cushion of the chair, and I could find no explanation at all.
After approximately an hour of inspecting both the exterior and the interior of the house, the officers informed the family that whilst the events were in fact very strange, without a physical culprit, they were essentially powerless to assist, as no crime had actually been committed. And Vic later claimed that the officers hurriedly left the house, as they too were apparently spooked by what they had witnessed. The following 4 days would see events escalate, with one incident reported by Vic of toys such as marbles and Lego launching across the room, some of which he claimed hit him in the elbow, causing a considerable bump to appear at the site of impact. And with visits from several authorities, including the local council, who the Hodgsons rented their home from, and members of the local church, Peggy Hodgson was approaching her wit's end, and desperate for help, Peggy Nottingham suggested they contact national newspapers in the hope that coverage of the story may attract someone who could help the Hodgsons in their plight. On the 6th of September 1977, journalist George Fallows and Daily Mirror photographer Graham Maurice arrived at the Hodgsons, and in the passing days would also be joined by their colleagues, journalist Douglas Bentz and photographer David Thorpe. Having immediately begun experiencing some of the reported phenomena, Fallows stated in a front-page article of the Daily Mirror, "Having kept observation at the house for 4 successive nights, I believe abnormal happenings are occurring. I have seen nothing unusual, but I have heard knocks, and I've been present when strange occurrences have been witnessed by others in a back bedroom." In the same article, Maurice claimed to have witnessed toy bricks being tossed through the air, and Bentz, who was in the same room as Maurice, backed up this claim. Convinced of paranormal activity and unable to lend any assistance or satisfactorily record the phenomena, the journalist called the Society for Psychical Research for help. Founded in 1882 and the first of its kind, the Society for Psychical Research, or SPR, is an organisation dedicated to the scientific study of what they classed as debatable phenomena designated by such terms as mesmeric, psychical and spiritualistic, nowadays more commonly known as the paranormal. The SPR answered the calls for assistance in the form of a man named Maurice Grosse, a British inventor who in his spare time had turned paranormal investigation following the death of his daughter Janet in 1976. Grosse joined the Daily Mirror journalists and again witnessed the reported phenomena firsthand, and eventually, overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation and amount of activity, Grosse requested further assistance from the SPR, and on the 12th of September he was joined by parapsychology author and fellow SPR member Guy Playfair, who brought with him Rosalind Maurice, a reporter for BBC Radio 4. The trio began recording audio, and whilst initially sceptical, Rosalind Maurice admitted on a BBC Radio 4 interview the next day that she was convinced of the activity when the group heard an enormous thump as a chair seemingly moved by itself across the room.
Well, Rosalind, you're looking fairly fresh, I must say, after that night and being up till 5:30 this morning. Are you persuaded?
I think I more or less am, yes. I mean, I think what convinced me was the enormous thump when the chair, whatever happened, moved across the room. I mean, I'm convinced there wasn't time for that little girl to have got out of bed, stood up, chucked the chair across the room, because something chucked the chair across the room. I'm convinced of that.
Over the next few months, Grosse would record in excess of 180 hours of audio across 180 visits, including 25 overnight vigils, and Grosse and Playfair would claim to bear witness to an ever-growing list of paranormal occurrences in the household.
What's happened? What did he do? I'd only just got in bed, put my head down, turned the light out, and that lands over there. And the light or something moved here.
Right, that's the front of the doll's house. It's thrown right across the room, over the top of the bed to the door.
Yes,
The doll's house is in the corner, away from the bed. And the light has jumped backwards from the end of the bed and is now under the bed.
Oh, that's true.
Around December of 1977, a new addition to the household arrived in the form of voices, seemingly produced by Janet, the younger of the two sisters, who had fast become the focus of most of the paranormal occurrences. At first, Grosse would record whistling and barking, and eventually came to the conclusion that if the entity could bark, it could talk, and he began insisting it said his name.
You got a doggy here.
I then said to it,
I then, as I said on the tape here, I then said to it, if you can whistle and bark and groan, then you can talk. And I asked it to actually say my name.
Well, just a minute. Right, we'll try again. I want you to call out my name, my complete name, Maurice Grosse. See if you can do that. Hello. Very good. Let me hear you say my name again. Come on, let me hear you say my name. Come on, my name's Maurice. Let me hear you say it. Maurice.
Now that was the first time we heard the voice, and since then we've been hearing it again and again, and it's been getting louder and louder.
Soon after this, the entity began speaking clearer and clearer, eventually conversing with Grosse and others, and whilst Janet and her sister Margaret claimed there were multiple voices and entities, one stood out from the rest. He called himself Bill Wilkins. Often foul-mouthed and aggressive in tone, Bill would reveal information not only about himself and his death, but but would comment on what was going on in the house, claiming that he was still living there and slept on top of Janet in her bed.
Why can't Janet feel you?
I'm invisible.
You're invisible? Why are you invisible?
Because I'm a G-H-O-S-T.
Eventually, the story reached a man by the name of Terry Wilkins, who confirmed not only had his father Bill previously resided at 284 Green Street, but also the circumstances preceding his death and how he died were correctly explained when Bill, speaking through Janet, was interrogated by Grosse's son, a solicitor by the name of Richard.
I want you to tell me whether you remember what happened to you when you died. Just before you died and just after you died.
Days before I died, I went blind. Then I had an hemorrhage and I fell asleep and I died in a chair in the corner downstairs.
With accusations of a hoax now rife, Janet was tested by several medical and scientific professionals, as well as popular ventriloquist Ray Allen, to ascertain whether she was capable of faking the voice, and skeptics would offer numerous explanations to dispute the evidence. Grosse, however, was convinced that the voice was 100% genuine, based on the fact that anyone attempting to replicate it, even for a few minutes, would find they suffered with a sore throat. Yet Janet was able to maintain conversations for up to 3 hours without even needing to clear her throat, and appeared to suffer no negative effects to her vocal cords. Grosse also claimed that Bill would also speak despite Janet's mouth being taped shut and full of water. Grosse eventually offered £500 or £1,000 in today's money to a nominated charity if anyone could replicate the voice in conditions specified by Grosse and without displaying any negative effects. No one took up the challenge. By 1978, the story had gone global, and in May of that year, the SPR undertook their own investigation of Grosse and Playfair's investigation, eventually concluding, with the help of Charles Moses from the Southern Californian SPR, that paranormal events were indeed occurring at 284 Green Street. In addition to Grosse and Playfair's investigation, 2 physicists by the name of John Hasted and David Robertson also both carried out their own individual scientific experiments and investigations of both Janet and the activity in the house. And again, both men claimed to witness occurrences that were difficult to explain through modern science. And several mediums and spiritual healers also attempted to help Janet with what was considered to be a paranormal attachment. While some claimed their interventions helped Janet and her behaviour, it did not seem to stop the haunting, and at one point, world-renowned paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren even arrived at the Hodgsons' home to offer their assistance. However, Grosse recalls that the Warrens were asked to leave after they had interviewed Janet, when the subject moved away from the investigation and towards monetising the situation. In July of 1978, Janet spent around 2 months in the Maudsley Hospital in an attempt to discover if there were any psychological or medical reason for Janet's behaviour and the alleged haunting. Based on the fact that prior to the poltergeist activity, Janet's parents had recently divorced, and the subsequent living conditions and upheaval could have had a traumatic effect on Janet and her sister Margaret. But all tests and examinations returned inconclusive, and Janet appeared not to be suffering from any psychological or physical illness. and by the end of 1978, the paranormal activity in the house was finally beginning to die down. Peggy Hodgson lived at 284 Green Street until her death in 2003. And whilst no more paranormal activity occurred, family would report that they always felt a presence in the home. And subsequent residents, unaware of the home's history, have also reported an uncomfortable feeling of being watched, with one family spending less than 2 months in the house before moving out. Janet suffered bullying at school both during and after the occurrences, and eventually left home at 16. She married young and started a family of her own in Essex, and while she initially insisted on anonymity, Janet has since appeared in several television programmes to recount her experiences, never once changing her story. Equally, Janet's sister Margaret and everyone involved in the investigation also maintain their claims. And while explanations ranging from childish pranks to Tourette's have been put forward to dispute the paranormal claims at 284 Green Street, no definitive argument has ever been put forward to completely disprove the haunting, and both believers and skeptics alike continue to be drawn to the story of the Enfield Poltergeist.